I recently finished a top 5 hunting myths and deer hunting myths, and it's been really popular on my channel. And I wanted to extend that because I started to leave out so many myths that extend into especially deer habitat management, whitetail habitat management. There's a lot of myths out there concerning that. And the whole reason I have this channel is that I actually want you to be successful. I mean, what I do for a living is travel around to clients. I design about 70 to 75 whitetail parcels a year. And then I write about it and complete videos all year. It's like taking notes from when I've been out in the woods. I take notes. I have over 200 just topics on my phone, and I do this over and over again. I have 5 books out about it, and so I spend a lot of time. This is what I do for a living. And so, you know, I'm not saying what I do is the perfect way or the only way, but this is a way that definitely works, and it's a system of concepts that I've developed over many, many years. And when it comes to myths and what you can and cannot expect to find success on in your own land, I want to bring that to you and make you guys real successful. So here it is. In the first one, I have a list right down here, but I know the first one, and it's deer poop. Interesting, when I'm out with clients all the time, I'll see clients talk about if it's clumped poop, it's got to be a big buck, right? Wrong. Deer are what they eat. And so although you might find clumped poop, solid pellets, separate pellets, whatever it might be, that doesn't necessarily indicate that it's a buck or a doe. And you could also tell when you get into areas where you have large pellets, whether they're clumped or not, mixed with small pellets, you know it's does and fawns. You know, a random buck just can go in there and drop some pellets down in front of you, or in front of those does and fawns. So those deer pellets, kind of imagine, and I like to think of in terms of extremes. Let's say those deer are eating woody browse, and that's all they ever eat, and including acorns, briars, woody shrub tips, whatever it might be, really dry food. Well, then that's going to be reflected in their pellets. Now imagine, I know it's never going to happen, now imagine those same deer ate Mexican food. Guess what's going to happen? I know what happens to me. I love Mexican food, and I'll keep going back for more, but it doesn't necessarily agree with my stomach, and I think if deer ate that, that'd be reflected in what their pellets were. It'd be a little bit runny. And then there's sure times in between where it's clumped all together. And we can go into the size of the butt, whatever it is, but we can go into a little bit deeper, but I don't think we need to. Just know that not always is buck poop clumped together. Second one, deer bedding canopy. If you think about it, now there are times where deer like to bed under canopy, and I'll say conifers, swamps, storms, heavy rainstorms, so you'll find them back in the spruce or cedars or conifer. That doesn't mean they want to be in there. There's no food in there. But two, deer bedding canopy with hinge cuts and high hinge cuts, and having deer go under those hinge cuts. And if you think about it, if deer needed a canopy to bed under, then you probably have about 99% of the habitat out there that the deer couldn't find a spot to bed in the woods. So just because you make that on your land doesn't mean the deer are expecting it, wanting it, even know that it's better than the neighbors. They really need that side cover and sprouting and food that comes from those hinge cuts, which means you have to have a lower hinge cut, and we'll talk about that in a second. But they do not need a canopy to bed under, and especially if you're taking the material that you could supply cover to the side and putting it on top, you can even place a deer in a position where, yeah, they're under that canopy, but they're not hiding from birds and planes, and now they're wide open on a knoll because there's no cover side to side. Now third, perennial food plot. Deer do not necessarily need perennial food, and especially summer food, in the north half of the country. Most locations, there's about 5 times more food than deer actually need, and a lot of times if you're in ag areas and you're in areas where there's a lot of beans, a lot of hay, a lot of alfalfa, then they have a lot of food available to them. And let's look at it this way. If you have perennial food on your land and you're trying to take a deer herd, put them on your land in the summer on a few acres of plots, taking them off, in theory, of the neighbor's farmland that's being professionally managed for volume, quality, and nutrients and harvest, then you could even make a case that because you're sticking a bunch of deer in one location, stressing them out on lower quality food than your neighbor's ag fields, that you're actually doing a disservice to deer during the summertime. That's not always the case. but you don't have to have perennial food to have a great deer herding. And I will challenge, even on smaller parcels like the one we're on right now, a 40-acre parcel, you could even make a case that less food during the summer is better, because you can put those resources and food towards the fall and have a lot better habitat for it, and actually have food at a time where you can influence the deer herd the most. Fourth, cover is king. Not so. Cover is great, but you have to have food. I just was in a conversation with one of my YouTube viewers, and they were saying that it seemed like the deer left their land. They had all this hinge cut area on their land and all this cover. The food is 2 miles away, and what happened? Well, they left for food. Great cover is dead unless it's supported by food. And so if the deer have to leave a half mile, 3/4 mile off your land to find food, then once they get into a distance of 200 to 400 yards and greater than that, 100 to 200 for does, and especially 200 to 400 for bucks, they'll bed behind those does, then in that case, they a lot of times are having to travel too far to get to their afternoon food source, so they move closer to that afternoon food source. Especially if you apply a hunting pressure in their bedding area at all, they'll just move closer and closer to that afternoon food source. So cover is great. You have to have cover, but you can't have cover without food. You can't have food without cover. It's kind of which came first, the chicken or the egg. But you have to have both, and I see a lot of great cover parcels that are lacking quality, consistent food during the hunting season, so the deer leave. And they can even be there September, October, November, and then leave November, December, because they have no food. And I find that quality food plots are about the only thing, unfortunately, you can have on private land that's going to compete with any kind of ag land around you, or even your neighbor's food plots too. So cover is not necessarily king. Food and cover is king. Deer need to drink often. I just saw this on a video the other day, and they said, well, the water holes are great because a deer can't go 1 to 2 days without water before they have to have it. And that is totally false. Humans can't go more than a few days without water before they die, but that's not the same with deer. They process moisture differently. For example, they can eat green forages for weeks at a time and not have to take a drink. They don't have to leave the land to find water somewhere. If that was the case, you'd have in some areas deer leaving for 2-3 miles to find water and come back, and that's not the case. They can drink all night. You know, a cool thing we find is we'll put a trail camera on a water hole, and you'll find that a huge amount of pictures in the evening. We had one camera, it was 800 photos. This is going back 12, 14 years on one of our first water holes, and 700 to 800 photos were in the evening after the deer had been sitting dry all day. After they're sitting out dry all day, the first thing you want to do is hit water on the way to food, but after they ate green food sources all night, no need to hit that water on the way back to their bedding areas in the morning. You'll find that as soon as the rut starts, there's definitely an uptick in mid-morning to mid-afternoon usage of the water by bucks because they're cruising, and then they really like to take a drink. But deer don't have to drink. They can go weeks at a time without taking a drink. Deer bedding grass. There's a lot of switchgrass, a lot of native grass that's being planted for deer. Let's say that it is sufficient cover and it's thick enough for deer to bed in. Well, there's no food in that grass. Deer feed 5 times in a 24-hour period. So if they can't find food in that grass in the early morning, early afternoon time slots during their bedding areas, then they're going to want to leave and find that food somewhere else. They have to have that daytime browse. So what I recommend is making sure that if you have a field, say a 10-acre field you're converting to deer bedding, you could put 40 to 60% of that in switchgrass surrounding diversity pockets of early successional growth, kill out the grass that's within that growth, and now you have broadleaf, woody stem regeneration shrubs and trees that are growing in those pockets, and that provides that browse, even goldenrod, ragweed, any kind of broadleaf, most broadleaf deer will eat. And if you have that surrounded by switchgrass, then you have the perfect combination of a field that has the structure of bedding needed, which would be the switchgrass. It'll stand up straight and tall. And then you have those food source pockets and browse pockets within. High hinge cuts. Hinge cuts that start right here are for the most part useless unless you're actually blocking off a ridge top over here and you need that higher height to get that angle about this high. Think about hinge cuts. There's 2 main functions of hinge cuts. You're trying to screen, provide side cover that deer can't see through to other deer, to you, you can't see them. you're hiding deer within, and then you want food from side sprouts or stump sprouts from those hinge cuts. If you start your cuts up here and that food is growing up here, not only is the food growing up here, but the cover is growing up at your head level too. Deer down here like this, they can see straight out. And a lot of times I see when I travel around the country, high hinge cuts with material that could have been used to push out to the side so deer can bed right here and have food on both sides and be surrounded by cover. Instead, those deer are bedding on the outside of the hinge cut area because they have to have that side cover, and that's where the browse is. And then in the interior during November, December, October, they're not using it. Who cares if they use it in May, June, July for shade? That's not real, that's not when you build a deer herd, and that's not really important to them. Horizontal rubs, really cool thing. I think there was an article a few years in one of the management magazines, and you know, the latest, greatest craze to go out there, a myth, and people use these horizontal rubs. Well, folks, a lot of mature bucks only visit one rub when they make it for the entire year. Now, I'm not saying there's not signpost rubs in staging areas. Deer are going out to food sources, and that's that staging area where they feel safe before entering out into the food. A lot of times they'll hit those same rubs over and over again. But what use is that? You know, does are typically not going to them, fawns are typically not going to them, and so if you're spending the time to make a horizontal rub and you're putting it out in a food source, for example, they're already going to the food source. So it really doesn't add any definition of movement, any reason for them to go to that food plot. They're already there, they're already feeding. I really like mock scrapes. Mock scrapes invite every deer in the neighborhood to hit that. And I put those 100 yards away from food and use it as a hunting spot. I usually have a stand within bow shot of every mock scrape I make, and most of those have cameras on because they give us a great buck inventory of what bucks are on our property during the daylight. A horizontal rub, it's a cool fad or myth or whatever, but it's not a lot of times practical or useful for you out there when you're managing your habitat and trying to create better whitetail habitat. I'm going to add this next one in here, and it's not really necessarily habitat related, but it is trail cam related. And there's that myth out there that deer don't see in red spectrum. Deer see red. They've been seeing infrared bulbs. We put them 14 feet up in the air to try to catch some neighboring trespassers on the land. Deer would look right up at them 14 feet in the air when those red lights would blink. And even worse yet, you can imagine, well, that's fine when it's taking a picture. They don't like that. But imagine when you have a video on for 10 seconds and it's just red solid. I've seen so many videos where those deer come in, look at the spot. People think it's their scent from 12 feet away on a plastic housing. Not the case. There are trail cameras that have made noises in the past, but most of them are dead silent nowadays. Take a test and look at a camera that watch deer as they go by during the daylight. If it's well hidden and it's 6 feet off the ground, it has a good profile hidden behind it, the width of the camera is hidden. Check and see how many deer look at it during the day, how many look at night, and you'll notice if you have infrared, they'll look at it almost every single time at night, where they might not look at it at all during the day. On the flip side, if you have a low camera, we'll just add this in, and deer don't look at it at night, but they look at it during the day, means your trail camera's not hidden enough. So there's a lot you can do with your trail cameras. Use the habitat to hide your trail cameras, and that's always a good idea. Native grass is sometimes great for wildlife, but if it's laying down, you know, there's a big focus on native grasses and this perfect blend. But if that grass is laying down in December, January, February, March, and the small game that relates to it, let alone whitetails, can't be there because that grass is down to the ground, then really what good is it? You don't build wildlife populations or whitetail populations during April, May, June, July, August, and September when that grass is still standing. Switchgrass a lot of times is the only grass, especially talking in the north half of the country. Switchgrass is often the only grass that you want to use for whitetail habitat improvements. And I talked earlier about how you can surround diversity pockets, surround areas of early successional growth, get broadleafs growing in there, even plant some shrubs. I use big rock trees out of Chippewa Falls. John Walton, he has some great habitat cuttings, willows, poplar, lots of dogwood that you can stab cuttings into the ground. They grow really well in those pockets, or let early successional growth take over, even add some conifers for some diversity. But more grass is just more grass. I encourage you to use the strongest single seed variety of switchgrass in those switchgrass plantings and go from there. I'll add one more thing when it comes to deer antler color. Antlers typically are not stained from base to tip because they're rubbing a certain color or type of conifer or type of tree. Instead, a lot of times, and that's why a lot of times you'll see older bucks that are more mature, they have darker antlers because they're back in the shade, and that shade is keeping their antlers brown because they're not exposed to the sun. That's why when you find sheds in February, March, they're bleached out white because they're exposed to the sun. Younger bucks, older bucks that are living out in marsh grasses, it's really interesting and cool how nature blends those antlers into the environment that they're at. Say a marsh buck, a giant marsh buck that's back there, he's exposed to the sun all the time, he's living by a beaver house out in the middle of nowhere. His antlers are going to blend in with the surroundings, and then you have that big swamp buck that's back in, staying in the shadows for a long time, he's dark. And thinking about it, bucks don't rub their antlers from tip to base, that's why the color is uniform often from tip to base. And then when it's dark, if they are rubbing, you'll see that they polish them down by the bases, but they're not polishing them the rest of the way up. So the antler color is really important. Hidden trail cameras within your habitat are critical. Deer don't like that square box, especially mature bucks. As I've talked before, if they look at those trail cameras and they can see them and they're out in the open, if you're trying to create a census and capture bucks, and if those bucks are looking at your trail cameras, doesn't matter if it's infrared or you're just not hiding that box, it's a bad thing for your land, for your habitat, for your deer management, and ultimately your hunting goals. Think about these myths. I went over the top 10, I think I discussed 12 or 13, maybe 14, but there's a lot of myths out there, a lot of fads when it comes to habitat management. We talk about things on this channel that are going to help you this year, things that I've seen. I've worked with close to 800 clients around the country. You can imagine the things I've seen, you can imagine the improvements that I've seen that don't work per my clients' instructions and feedback. And so there's a lot of mistakes I've made on my own, that's why I teach this stuff. There's a lot of mistakes I've seen clients make, and then I can match those mistakes I've made. I can see those patterns repeat around the country. I brought these tips to you today because I want truly for you to have a better habitat, hunting, and herd experience this coming season.